Did you first grow curious about the paranormal? Dare you dig deeper? You are listening to House of Asher.
And welcome, everybody. This is the House of Asher. I am your host, Steve Asher. It's good it kind of worked out that way. And so anyway, what we're doing, this is actually episode 110. And you may be listening to us on Spreaker. You may be listening to us on iHeart, iTunes, all those things, Spotify, SoundCloud, good Lord, YouTube. Also Paranormal UK Radio, which carries us worldwide, and it's a great honor to, have my little show out there and in the ether and connecting with other like-minded folks, and it's a real joy. Make sure to go to stevieasher.com, plug. That's my little page where you can find out about my books and my art and all the other goofy things that I'm doing. So anyway, as you guys know, definitely was a monster kid. Loved 70s and 80s, like, made for TV movies. Probably as much, if not more, than a lot of the big movies that were out. But it was a thing of that, these characters really had heart, be it, in the series, be it the Columbo series, be it the Kolchak series and all this. There's so much that was going on from there. But, and even beyond that, up into the 80s and further, other people share that same love, and they revisit some of that. And one of those people are with us tonight, Mr. Mark Dawidziak. I hope I didn't butcher it. Now, this gentleman has been a film and theater critic for 35 years, for more than 35 years, actually. And he has written Grave Secrets and tons and tons of stuff. I can't even get into the amount of movies involved with the amount, and we will just talk about it. Let's just have him on. Mark, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks, Steve.
Man, anytime. And again, it was funny because I mainly knew you as the Kolchak guy, the Columbo guy, and the guy who does Mark Twain. That was my foot in the door. That was my gateway to the world of Mark. And it's a real honor having you on, man. I really do appreciate it.
Well, I have to tell you that it is a deeply schizophrenic resume. I copped to that right away. I was doing a book event about a year ago, and I had a spread of my books on the table, and somebody came along and looked at the books, and there were 3 Mark Twain titles on there. There was the Twilight Zone, there was the Dracula book, and the horror novel, and there was one on Theodore Roosevelt, and he just, after a while, looked like his head was going to explode, and he said, "I don't get it." And I said, what's not to get? He said, well, what's the common theme here? And I said, me, I'm the common theme. I'm the one who wrote all these books or edited these books. These are my interests. These are my passions. These are all a reflection of who I am. You put all this together, and this is who I am. So, and I don't like repeating myself. So I don't tend to write the same book over and over again. And I like new challenges. So yeah, it's all me. Now, a good deal of it's going to be Mark Twain because of the influence of Mark Twain, but a good deal of it's going to fall on what I like to call the spooky side of the street, because I too was a monster kid. We didn't have that term. We didn't use that term when I was growing up in the 60s. We just all got Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. We all watched the Hammer horror films as they showed up. We all watched the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits. We were all influenced by the same things. We were part of this big community that didn't have an internet that kept us together. So we read Famous Monsters or Castle of Frankenstein. And that's what kept us together. That's what, and the influences were all kind of the same. They were shared because there wasn't that much. So we all watched everything, and you kind of could watch everything. You could watch old Universal horror films. You could watch 50 science fiction. You could watch the Outer Limits. You could watch it all. And when something new came along, we were all excited about it. Like, oh, there's a new Hammer film coming out, or there's this new series coming up. So it was a very shared experience. Even though you weren't as connected as you are today by the internet and such things, you kind of felt more of a sense of community back then because we all did share the same things.
Well, I know that, again, one of my things too, obviously, one of the first comics I ever got was I think I don't even know if it was a comic. I think it was more like eerie or something like that, or
Mm-hmm.
one of the
Creepy
creepy,
or eerie or one of those.
creepy, spooky. Yeah, right. So because I was just like you, I come up with all those creature features and
Mm-hmm.
horror hosts and all that, and it was cool, man. You know, and it wasn't a thing that. It wasn't even a thing. It's just certain people gravitate toward that, and I find that that's another common theme. You know, which we can get into talking about the Jim Tooley book as well. But there's that gritty. It's just as real as the kind of nuclear family type situation or atomic age family, if you're talking about 50s type stuff. But no one touches on it. It was more of a disenfranchised.
In some cases, it's more real. The truth is that horror, in particular, horror plays it for real. You know, there's two things that play it for real, and they are the two things which get the least respect when it comes to entertainment and literature and critics, which is a funny thing coming from a critic, I guess. But there's two things, and that's humor and horror. If you write humor and horror, for some reason, the culture relegates you to the children's table,
Right.
and that you're writing something which is a lesser thing. But in truth, they are the most powerful metaphoric tools we have to deal with the grand issues and the difficult issues, the issues we don't like to talk about and we don't like to think about. Humor lets us do it in one way, and then horror is the flip side of the coin. They are very closely allied, these two things. They even sound alike. You write them out. Humor, horror, two-syllable words beginning with H, ending in R. And they are extraordinarily difficult to do. That's another thing they have in common. There are only a few true masters of these forms. And they don't get much respect. The two forms do not get much respect. A publication like The New Yorker in the 1960s and 1970s is going to champion some novel about some professor's midlife crisis at a Michigan university, and that's going to be literature. But Stephen King, is that how? Oh no, that's how we can't have that. But if you were going to want to know about what life was like in America in the 1970s and 80s, 100 years from now, guess what? You're going to have to read Stephen King, because Stephen King's the only one that's writing about the real American issues that are underneath all of that stuff. He's playing it for real, and he's telling you what life was like down at the 7-Eleven, or what it was like down at the corner drugstore. And you're not going to get that from the literature that was championed by the New Yorker and other publications. And so it's not only as valid and as real as other forms, it's in many cases more real. And I have very little tolerance with critics who dismiss humor and horror as somehow being lesser forms. They are also for the people who actually write and know and make a living putting nouns and verbs together, and whose livelihood depends on that. They will tell you in an instant, these are the two hardest forms to write. John D. MacDonald, the mystery writer, once said that. He said that the two hardest forms to write were humor and horror. And he said it's basically because in the wrong hands, the humor becomes horrible and the horror becomes humorous. And it's very, very easy to goof it up and mess it up. And so we have only these few true masters of the art, and very, very few of them actually live generation to generation. So it's one. I have very little patience with people who want to put down these forms, because they are the most incredible metaphoric tools with dealing with the human and too often inhuman condition.
Well, there's, and it's probably overused, but I'll say it, both of those forms are visceral, but both of those are cathartic.
Right. You can't fake it either. You cannot fake what makes you scream in terror and what makes you laugh out loud at something funny. You either do or you don't, but you can't fake it, and you can't lie to yourself. You cannot lie to yourself about what scares you and what makes you find funny. You're standing with a group of friends, and you're standing on a sidewalk, and all of a sudden somebody goes by you, and they trip and they fall. Well, half of the people standing there are going to bust out laughing because it's funny to them. And the other half are going to be terrified, going to run. Is this guy all right? Is he both basic, valid, human responses? But you cannot fake how you respond to it. The person who laughs might then go see if the person's all right. But the response of their heart, the first response that they could not fake was to bust out laughing at somebody falling in front of them. And there are a lot of people who think somebody falling is the funniest thing they've ever seen. We wouldn't have a lot of slapstick comedy if that weren't true.
Oh, yeah,
The deal of silent comedy
exactly.
would disappear if that weren't true.
Right.
So
we never would have seen Two Regular Shorts. We never would have seen, all the early Stooges and all that stuff that come from that kind of vaudevillian, Borscht Belt kind of acts, that became such a part of, like you said, of American. I guess you would call it American comedy. Of course, we're going to put our stamp on it, but that's what's so great about it. And like I said, you seem really in tune with that, and that's what I really dig.
Probably because those were the two earliest influences on me. Well, I grew up in New York. I'm 62. I never hide my age because I've earned every gray hair and every wrinkle. Right. But I'm 62, and so I was born in 1956. And my earliest influence was watching the New York television stations. And there was no Nickelodeon back then. There was no Disney Channel. There was no channel or form that was basically designed to program for kids. So they gave us primarily what was children's program on New York stations at the time was the comedy of our parents and in some cases our grandparents. So we got the Three Stooges. We got Abbott and Costello. We got Laurel and Hardy. And we got it all the time. It was constant. So comedy was the first, and particularly comedy teams, was the first and primary influence. Everything leads from that. And at 7 years old, WPIX, dear old WPIX Channel 11 in New York, was showing a film called Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. I had never seen a horror film at that point. I was 7 years old. I didn't know what a horror film was. I wasn't there for the Frankenstein half of that title. I was there for the Abbott and Costello half of the title because I had seen a lot of Abbott and Costello and I loved them. And that movie was what turned me instantaneously into a horror fan. That movie in particular, the performance of Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula, because he's just magnificent in that film. He is in full command of that performance. And that turned me into fascinated not only with the Count Dracula character, but the vampires in general. And, I grew up to write a book on Dracula, and I grew up to teach a course at Kent State on vampires in film and television. So you are rewarded for following your passions. You are rewarded for not letting go of the things of your youth that really started to fire you up. As G.K. Chesterton said, every true genius holds on to something of the nursery, holds on to something of their childhood. Right. And I think that's very true. We say it like be in touch with your inner child. But my inner child is very close. And as a matter of fact, this is it. He's right here, and it's not even a case of being in touch with your inner child. It's keeping your inner child alive and not letting it die. That's the key.
Right, and don't let anybody pull you away from it. I know, and I won't get too much into myself. I apologize, but my wife, my long-suffering wife, Cheyenne, hooks up with if I find like I'd found a Vincent Price, a signed Vincent Price picture, and of course I got it framed and up in my little studio, along with my first my childhood horror host, The Count of Five, who I think took on creature features after Cecil Creep left. It's around the same time of having Sammy Terry and those guys, Chilly Willy, all those guys in Cincinnati. And but that was the thing for the longest time, because I had worked in corrections and law enforcement and stuff, and you got a lot of kids and this and that. You don't have money for all that stuff, but I'm at that point. I'm just a hair from being 50, which I guess I'm a kid, but I'm feeling it. But I'm at that point of going, you know what, there's no reason I can't have one of those tester model Frankenstein, type deals, or the early, or even the little bit sillier, like the Disney released ones, that were was a little bit less horrific, but still really cool and had the action, the like one or two movements and stuff. And that's the thing. You put on your big boy shoes, you go out, you do your thing, you take care of your family. But there's also a point when you start getting a little bit older. And my kids had always been exposed to horror, age appropriate. I didn't just throw them right into, say, the Exorcist or some of the Italian films, Gates of Hell or whatever. But especially stuff like that would be, say, on the Svengoolie show and like, the earlier hosts and stuff. They always knew, but they always loved comedy as well. And like you said, if you can do one, you can do the other. The late Robin Williams, perfect example. He could play really dark characters because he found his comedy and that also dark, menacing element from stuff that was in them. Every comic, every writer, I think, I had to say it for, as regard to myself, you take something dark or something that hurt you, that you carry, and you put it either in some which way in the book, and you work it out, and then I don't know, it's weird. It's like taking coal and compressing it into a diamond.
It is, I mean, if you could, I assume your listeners are not going to be able to see me in any of this, but if they could, and they could see behind me, right, and there's a shelf up here, has all 13 of my Aurora monster models from the 1960s.
Yeah, I'm coveting them right now.
All of them, they're all right there. And, Dracula was the first. I got it for my birthday after I'd seen Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Then Frankenstein, then the Wolfman, then the Mummy, and I eventually got all 13. And I've held on to them as I have most of the things. A staggering amount of the stuff that I had, I did not have the mother who threw it all out. So it came back to me. And some of it is the models have followed me state to state. As I moved from New York to Washington, D.C., to Virginia, to Tennessee, to Ohio, they have gone with me. They have been my constant companions. Which is just a symbolic way of saying I never lost the interest in those things. The only thing that happened was that the interest got deeper and more profound as I got older. So I think you're absolutely right with what you're saying about sharing this and making it's your kids are very lucky. They're getting an education. They're getting the proper education. So many people are not exposed to this anymore, and the attention span is just straightforward. It's just to the thing of today, and nobody looks back anymore. Very little jumps generation to generation. But one of the places it does tend to jump is in the genre stuff, because genre people tend to be a little bit more aware of the history. They tend to be a little bit more aware of the tradition under which they are enjoying the entertainment. So they do tend to look back. And while maybe comedy fans, and I'm sorry to say this, but people who say they're into comedy may no longer know who the Marx Brothers are, and they don't. Horror fans do have a good shot at knowing who Karloff and Lugosi were. And I think that's nice. I think that's another nice thing about the genre is there is a lot more awareness of the grand traditions in which all of this came about.
Well, let me ask you this before, and we will get more into the books and whatnot and all that. I was of the Universal monsters. I was always more drawn toward the Wolfman, which for me, Chaney is the Wolfman, and it was a thing of, I don't know, I connected really something. I don't know what it was, something in my head. I connected with it. I think part of it too was, like you said, the Appalachian upbringing and stuff like that, and the old stories that we had, and the old, there's curses, there's that stuff. It exists, in Appalachia, and I just connected to it. I was not suave. I was not sexy enough to be a vampire, and so I went. But yeah, I can get the frustrated, kind of angsty. I mean, it's to me like the Wolfman is like the perfect teenager. Frankenstein to me is like more or less a child that they thought it was a good idea to have, and then he was discarded. He was more or less just a latchkey kid. Okay, I know I'm getting a little young with it and stuff, and kind of breaking it down like that, but I mean that's just sort of my thing on it. But what drew you to the Strigoi, to the vampire? What pulled you in?
Well, it's interesting you said that the Wolfman as a teenager, because that's because most people, I think, they first discover horror when they are very small, when they're in the 5 to 8 range, and they see a quote unquote scary picture of some kind. But you don't really decide whether or not you're going to be a horror fan really until you're a teenager. The seeds are planted when you're smaller, but whether those seeds actually blossom and sprout, really the question is when you're a teenager. And I think because that's when you're either going to reject it or you're going to go deeper with it. And because the teen years are when you feel most like a monster. Now, this is when, horror really gets wonderfully metaphoric, because almost all the monsters are about outcasts or people who change. And when you're going through adolescence, you're actually changing. You're actually changing from one time or another. Is there ever a time when you feel more awkward, more unsure, more monstrous, if you will, than when you're going through that incredibly difficult transition from childhood to young adult? Those middle years are tough years, and horror can be a real life raft at that point. And when you say about like what you identified with the Wolfman, the universal monsters, they're like a Rorschach test. They're like the ink blots. When you say like, which one did you? It says a lot about you when you say so. So I was immediately intrigued by Dracula. I was immediately intrigued by the character. But at the same time, I was equally intrigued by the vampire hunters, by the Van Helsing side of the equation. And I think that's what's kind of interesting about that book. You go all the way back to what Stoker did. And I don't want to get too deep into this because, we get bogged down in this real fast. But I love the sort of religious symbolism in that book. Is that Stoker was Irish, but he was Protestant. He was Church of Ireland, which was Ireland's version of the Church of England. And all of the characters in Dracula are Protestant, and all the characters in Dracula respond to the story as Protestants, as Church of England people. There are only 2 Catholic characters in the entire book. One is Dracula. He might be what we call a lapsed Catholic, but he's Catholic. He would have been Catholic in the area of Romania in which he was. And the other is the symbol of good that emerges from Catholic Holland to do battle mano on Protestant soil. These 2 Catholic figures clash. I don't know that Stoker thought about it or what, but the symbolism is amazing, that the symbol of evil and the symbol of good, of virtue, are both Catholic, and everybody else is Protestant in that book. And I was raised Catholic, and and I was attracted to both. This is a really good question because nobody's ever asked me about this before, and I've never articulated this before. But I really do think that that's probably one of the reasons I was attracted to both Van Helsing and Dracula simultaneously. Dracula, the symbol of power, the symbol of forbidden power, the symbol of, and Catholics mix that with their guilt and their pageantry all the time. It's a very powerful mix. It's always amazed me that how many really of our best horror writers shared something, which was either they were raised Catholic, like Anne Rice.
Yeah, I was just going to say Anne Rice. Yeah.
Or they were raised in an incredibly strict Protestant upbringing, like Wes Craven and Stephen King had very, very strict, and if you're raised in either of those, good and evil are very palatable things. Heaven and hell are very real things. All of this is played for real, and then the Catholics play it out in pageantry every Sunday on a grand place. that's going to fire up your imagination. It's also going to put all that stuff in your head, all that repression, all the guilt, all the idea of sin and redemption. All of that's going to be in there. And then when you're a teenager, you hit your rebellious point and all of that explodes. And with it goes your imagination. It's the perfect upbringing for a horror writer or a horror director. Perfect. You could not ask if you were going to do something like the Hogwarts of preparing horror writers or horror directors or horror actors. This is it. This is the grand training ground. So I fit that sort of because I think I was right for this when the Dracula figure came along, and then with it came, one of the things that we all kind of got hit on. You're a little young for this, but in 1967, all of a sudden there's a vampire running loose in daytime television with the Barnabas Collins character on Dark Shadows. And as soon as you heard that, if you were a horror fan, you're like, what? There's a vampire running? Oh, you were there. And that character of Barnabas starts as a traditional Dracula figure and then asks questions no vampire before him had ever asked, forever changing the vampire. He starts to ask questions like, can I change? Do I have to live like this? He asks about his own nature. Now, vampires don't question their own nature. They're predators. But this one wondered whether he could reclaim his soul or not. And ultimately he does, and he becomes the hero of the show. He goes from being Dracula to Van Helsing over the course of the show. That's amazing. That's an amazing thing to have been watching at the time. So I can remember watching Hammer films and being as enamored of Christopher Lee's Dracula as I was Peter Cushing's Van Helsing. So I really do think that's one of the reasons it started there. It all came along for the ride, however. I don't want you to think like, it was vampires to the exclusion of everything else. I loved it all. Anything that came along, particularly the Universal films. But if it was a mummy picture with Lon Chaney Jr., I was there. If it was Werewolf of London with Henry Hull, I was there. If it was a Frankenstein film, I was there. So it all came along for the ride, and thank goodness, because it endlessly enriched my life.
I'm with you on it. Like I said, my wife, her mother was a big Dark Shadows fan, and like she would watch that with her in syndication, and so she was already aware. I was not as aware of that as she was, because I was ready. Okay, I had again, I mentioned my mom's Appalachian and stuff, but she would love to read those those like pulp magazine, those detective magazine, Death Cab for Cutie, a duffel bag full of heads, and the missing priest and whatever, all these whacked out things, and of course, those are right next to the what did you call them, like Weekly World News and Inquirer, which of course we'd get those from time to time, and all the unsolved mysteries and the In Search ofs and all those things, all that went in with that. So I had the weird backup of pulp exposure. I did have some exposure to stuff like Algernon Blackwood and M.R. James and some of the early, of course, Lovecraft, which you were talking about being affected, and subtext, which, I'm sure people beat it to death that, obviously there's like xenophobia involved with Lovecraft, with, foreign folks and stuff, but also the vampire, the forbidden, the exotic Romanian, and so there's a lot of stuff it's telling. You look at it and kind of go, when was this written? Oh yeah, obviously this is a 19th century mindset. Even Poe. There's so much tied in with it from the time, which that's what kills me is that. Okay, I will go on a rant.
Go ahead. Well, I like rant.
Okay.
I'm all the time I say.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying, I hate it that kids are not being taught in school to write cursive and to understand that, because they're losing so much rich history. Not everything is on Google, and
that's right.
There's a lot of stuff that is lost, and that's one of those things. A lot of that stuff, early things are still in manuscripts, Tolkien and stuff like that, early works that were never released, and it bugs me, 'cause like you said, It seems like now it's like, hurry up and go. We should have already been there. Just give me the cliff notes. There's no soul to it. It's all the act. It's almost, it's like, sex without love making. It's all interconnected.
Let's not be too rough on them. It's not their fault.
No, I agree.
And I tell my students this at Kent State. I always tell them this, which is, the culture and the generation in front of you did a real number on you guys. First off, you grew up with standardized tests. Everything you grew up with was, tell me what I need to know to pass the course. You learned like a seal learning to play bicycle horns in the proper order. And if you did, you got a cracker for it. And you weren't learning for the sake of learning, for the love of learning. Standardized tests do not excite anybody about learning. They just get everybody marching in order to the same spot. So that's number one. Number two, they were given glowing screens from childhood on. They were basically not given anything which excited the imagination. And this is the thing, and I always tell my students, so, you're going to get out and you're going to be working soon. And you're going to be facing a lot of prejudice against you because people who hire, the employers love to generalize about the millennials. The millennials. And the first thing they're going to say is that you're stupid or you're lazy. And you're not stupid and you're not lazy. I know you. None of you are stupid. None of you is not one of you is lazy. You all work incredibly hard for me in my class, because you have to if you're in my class. I said, but I'll tell you what you're not. You're not curious. And curiosity is what's going to carry you to higher and higher levels. But there's nothing exciting their curiosity. Like, for instance, I show them the first film they see in my vampire on film and TV course is Nosferatu. It's the starting point. It's the headwaters. So for many of them, it's the first black and white movie they've ever seen. It's the first silent movie they've ever seen. And for some of them, it's an excruciating experience because it's everything they hate. It's old, it's slow, there's no color, there's no special effects, there's no CGI. And I get it, and I tell them, you don't have to like it. You just have to appreciate it. You just have to know why it's important. I don't ask you to like anything. But the other half of the class are transported, and they are amazed. And it's truly almost a transforming experience for them. And yet, and I've been teaching this course since 2009, twice a year, each semester, since 2009. Not one has ever come up to me afterwards and said, that was great. What other silent movies should I watch? That's the first thing I would have asked. And I think one of the reasons is, if you grew up in the 60s and 70s, you grew up with a television which, because there were only 3 or 4 channels, everything was shared. All the cultures were shared. Now, if you're into a certain thing, you just go to one channel and you don't experience anything else. But if you were watching something as banal as a variety show, like the Ed Sullivan Show in the 1960s, you were exposed to what? Opera, ballet, jazz, rhythm and blues, old vaudeville, new comedy, the Rolling Stones, the Who. It was a smorgasbord, and it didn't mean you were going to like all that stuff. But maybe somebody saw Ray Charles on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they were there for the Beatles, or they were there for Jimmy Durante, or they were there for Dean Martin. But they listened and said, wait a minute, what is this? And they discovered rhythm and blues or jazz because they saw something on the Ed Sullivan Show, because everything was shared. And you got exposed to it. You got a chance to be exposed to it. So if you're growing up in that era, your head was on a swivel. You were looking back at the entertainment that was before, and you were encouraged to do that. You were looking at the entertainment of that day, or right now, and you were looking up ahead at what was going to be around the corner. And, most of the culture now leaves behind stuff very, very fast. The music of 2 years ago isn't even valid anymore. You know, groups from the 90s don't tour. Guess why? You know, is that there's no loyalty to it. They've left it behind. The Rolling Stones are what's left of them can still tour. The Eagles are what's left of them can still tour.
Right.
But acts from the last 20 years have a hard time. And that's, you know, because the culture just leaves less and less on. Every time the wave comes in, it leaves less and less on the shore. And so curiosity is, if I could give them one thing, it's not intelligence. They don't need it. It's not industry. They don't need it. But if I could give them a shot, if I could give them something that would inoculate them, it would be curiosity. Because without curiosity, you ain't going nowhere. And that's what we were. I mean, we were. Again, you don't discover all those Universal. You saw one Universal film, and then you had to see another. Okay, I saw Dracula. Now there's this thing, Frankenstein. What else is there? You know, and you wanted to know. You wanted to see it all. You know, when I was 7 years old, I not only saw my first horror film in the sense of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, I also saw my first Marx Brothers movie. It wasn't even one that's considered one of their better ones. It was Room Service.
I think there's like Horse Feathers or something.
No, it was Room Service, but I could immediately detect that this was different. This was like pure oxygen. There was something different going on here that had been in the Laurel and Hardy and Abbott and Costello and Three Stooges world. And I immediately set out to find out how many films they made. And I found that they made 13 films. And I wanted to see all 13. Steve, it took me 6 years to do it. 6 years of late night viewings, library showings, revival houses, right. Sometimes seeing chopped up versions. But when I was 13, and after 6 years, I saw all 13 Marx Brothers. You could do it in a day, 2 box sets, and you could literally watch them all in a 24-hour span. But my students do not even know who they are. You might as well be talking about leaders of the Russian Revolution when you talk about the Marx Brothers.
Right.
It's gone. And the Marx Brothers used to be a rite of passage. It used to be, you know, at some point you discovered the Marx Brothers, like you discovered W.C. Fields. And then later generations, it was people like George Carlin and Richard Pryor. But they don't know them any more than they know the Marx Brothers.
Right.
Well, you know, it can't all start with Adam Sandler, is what I'm saying.
Well, no, I mean, but even, you know, it's funny you mentioned Sandler because he's you know, one of the shows, or one of the guys that the kids really liked, and especially like Billy Madison and all that stuff. And we can literally quote the whole film.
And that was not a slam at Adam Sandler.
No, not at all. No,
saying that's, you know, what I'm saying is that there's nothing that gets them going beyond that. And so a lot gets, and it's, if I could have been told at 7 years old, hey, you can, here are these 2 boxes, and inside these boxes are all 13 Marx Brothers movies. I mean, it would have been something out of, you know, Aladdin and his lamp. You know, it was like, what? You know, I mean, really? I mean, I can have that? But, you know, but it's like now the riches of the world are there, and they ignore it.
The hunt's not there. You know, but think about it. If someone had handed you, as a young man, a box set of all those films, and yeah, there would be the gratification of, boom, it's right there. But would it have been as endearing to you as putting the work in? That sort of thing that your dad said, well, son, you know, I could go buy you a car, but if you earn your car, you're going to you know, I can hear him in my head right now.
Yeah, I mean, because each one was like a triumph. Each one was like you know, you're absolutely right. It's the thrill of, you know, it's one of the reasons I think I turned to book writing, is because books are long distance. You have to be a long distance runner to write a book. You could write a column and be a sprinter. You can run the 50-yard dash, but you have to be willing to train for the marathon to write a book. And it takes a lot of patience, but each thing becomes this wonderful little triumph within the bigger triumph. So it's amazingly gratifying, and I think that helps. You have to have a lot of patience, and you have to have a lot of fortitude to stick with a book. You have to love it a lot. If you don't love it, you're going to grow to hate it, because books take a lot of work. And anyway, that's off subject a little bit. But as you say, I always tell my kids too that you have to endure my rants if you take this class, but it's okay. My rants tend to be entertaining, and you'll have a good time with it. So.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, and we'll get actually into your books. Todd Browning's Dracula. Now, did you ever happen to see Freaks?
Yeah,
sure. I really enjoyed it, and it was one of those things that was so funny. You couldn't find it here for the longest time. My Kentuckian come out for the longest time, and I'd gotten it because I'd always heard about it. I never was able to find it, and I got it and I watched it, and it was to me it was a story of unity, the underdog. Again, it's the flip side of polite society, and they got their comeuppance, and when we get the film away, it's only like it was 100 years old now, I guess, but they did exact their revenge, and and at the end of it, but it's interesting, like you said, that it's one of those things that if today, I'm sure there is on YouTube or wherever, or some other format, but to take that now, like if you try to make that film now, and I'm not saying, of course, we need to be more considerate. This is coming from a father of special needs children, and special needs adoption. But I don't know if you could make that film like it was now. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, because obviously, as a society grows, there's going to be a change in mindset, and you're not going to just necessarily walk on people with infirmities and stuff. But it's just, I wonder, like you said, the way it is now, the way horror is now, I don't know if some of those classic films could be made, because I knew they were talking about doing a Universal reboot. They were trying it, I think, with The Mummy, and it just sort of kind of stunk on ice, and everybody hated it. I knew they were going to come out with like Jekyll and Hyde real soon, and some other stuff, and it just burnt. It fizzled completely out, and I don't know if maybe the audience isn't there for it, or maybe they dumbed it down. Maybe they said, well, no, we have to put a lot of action scenes in it, or they're going to be interested. I wonder if they kind of poisoned the well, or could it have been something great again?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, yes. I mean, what you're saying about, there's a lot of things that couldn't be made today. They're made, a good deal of comedy, Mel Brooks could not be made today. Try to get Blazing Saddles made today, with a lot of the humor that's in it. There is a lot more writing in a straitjacket in a way that than we've ever been before, and some of that's good, and some of that's bad, and that's what I always sort of tell my students is, I never want you to get the idea when you look up here that this is the oldest old fart talking at you guys, because the truth is there is no such thing as the good old days. Every era has its advantages and disadvantages, and everything's a trade-off. Nothing is a bargain. There will be an upside to it, and there will be a downside to it. And if you go to any era and you look at how something was made and what era it was made, I'll tell you what the upside was, and I'll tell you what the downside was. And that's true of technology. It is true of any advance. It is true of anything. You live in your time, and your time has. I love it when people say, "Well, I was born out of my time. I should have lived in the Victorian era."
Yeah.
And I think when the streets smelled of horse dung, and you probably would have died at 40, and appendicitis could carry you off, and the water was full of dysentery, and really, you think you wouldn't have lasted 10 seconds if we could have done that. So, the trick in horror is to be smart enough to write in your own era, is to live in your own era, and allow that to come out naturally to reflect your era. It's one of the things I show in my vampire class. Is I say, every vampire was shaped by its era. It was shaped by its time. The vampire does not shape us. We shape it. We bend it metaphorically to our needs. Why does the vampire in Nosferatu look the way he does? There's a specific reason he looks the way he does, and it's because of what happened in the 10 years before. And that's the First World War and the Spanish influenza. And it hit Germany, a defeated nation, very, very hard. So now you have a vampire that looks like plague, that looks like the carrier of plagues, rats. And there are rats all over that movie. I say to them, do you think that happened by mistake? Because this comes out of Germany in 1922, and this vampire looks like a plague carrier. And that's what he is. And it's a message to the country. It's a hopeful message, which is saying, look, a lot of people are going to die. Young people are going to die. They have to die. That's the sacrifice. But we have to hang in there. We have to stay together. And if we do, the sun will come up and we will see a better day. It's a very hopeful film from that standpoint at a very dismal time in German history. But that vampire looks the way he does for a very specific reason. And then Lugosi looks the way he does for a very specific reason. And then Christopher Lee looks his way. And it's the times that are shaping the vampire. And when you do horror, you have to not try to reach back and impose that. You have to make your own vampire, your own werewolf, your own mythology. And what the mistake is, if you just say, well, we're going to go back and we're going to make freaks, but you can't recapture what a freak show was like in 1935. You cannot recapture what America was like in 19. Freaks is freaks. It's what it was for all the good things and bad things in it, for all the baggage it has, and for all the great things. What I don't like is when people sort of dismiss something because of the bad things and say, well, you know, there's this in there. Well, of course there wasn't there. It's reflective of its times. It's reflective. You cannot take out a 2019 yardstick and put it against something which was made in the 1930s and say it doesn't measure up. Well, of course it doesn't measure up. And, you know, 100 years from now, people are going to look at our generation and they're going to take out a yardstick. They're going to take out a 2119 yardstick, put it against 2019 and say, look where they failed. Look where they didn't come up.
Right.
Well, you know, that's just what it is.
Well, that kills me, too, because like you see stuff like the Mark Twain book, you know, it's talking about, I'm not saying the derogatory term, but Jim, the character Jim, and everyone had lost their minds, and I'm saying, look, that's part of history. I'm not saying to glorify that, but you look at that and go, oh, is that what it was? Okay, well, that was an element of the time and the locale. It was what it was. I've never been one to whitewash history. It's always because, again, I'm a very much an honorer of history. I'm a big history buff, and so it's always kind of bothered me. But let me ask you this, because I do want to talk a little bit about the Kolchak books and things like that, because we've been all over the place, but it's been fun. What pulled you to it? What, there had to have been something that really tweaked you because you wrote so much.
Oh, sure. Well, here's how it happened. Okay, here's the tale as I heard it. When the commercials for The Night Stalker showed up around in October of 1971, right towards around Halloween, ABC started airing the commercials. The commercial campaign on Night Stalker was incredible. It was really, they were really, really good spots. And if you were a horror fan like I was 15 at the time, you were like, what is this? What's this going to be? It had everybody talking. It had like, what is it going?
Well, you know, and the crazy thing that, you know, that I noticed from the film, or from the series, well, the original,
and
right.
And they had very prestigious films, and they hired some of the best writers and directors to work on those films. And they aired in October of 1971. They aired a film called Brian's Song, which was about the Chicago Bears and the friendship between Brian Piccolo and Gale Sayers, the two running backs, who competed for the same time and were best friends, and they broke the NFL color barrier as roommates, rooming on the road together. And then Brian Piccolo developed cancer. He battled cancer. So this was a very moving story. It was a story about two families. It was a very prestigious, and everybody knew Brian's song was going to win a lot of Emmys, but it set the record for ratings for a TV movie at that point. It held that record for all of about 2 months, because along comes Night Stalker in January of 1972 and completely demolishes that record. ABC was a little chagrined by it, because here's this horror movie that, you know, we were putting it all on Brian's song. And here comes Night Stalker, and everybody was watching, but I was watching. It meant a lot to me, because I think one of the reasons the Night Stalker works so well is because it hit all three levels of what I was kind of interested in at the time, but it also hit all three levels with the country. First off, it's a traditional horror story. It's a traditional horror story of a Dracula-like character invading a major city. But in this case, what a great idea. The city is Las Vegas. It is the distinct American town. It's Sin City. And if you're a vampire, where would you go? How about a city that's on your time schedule, that's up all night? Las Vegas is a smorgasbord for a vampire. What a great idea. So it works as a horror film. It works very, very well as a horror movie, and the pedigree behind it, that Richard Matheson adapted Jeff Rice's novel, Dan Curtis, who had done Dark Shadows, produced it. Amazing team behind that film. So it works as that. It also worked as kind of a traditional newspaper comedy, because it's a very funny movie. On top of everything else, Kolchak is like this throwback character to the front page era of the 1920s and 30s of, you know, newspaper comedies, and, you know, Cut the Gab, Sweetheart, Get Me Rewrite, and, you know, Clark Gable and Frederick March type of characters. And so he was that kind of character. And then it worked as a traditional detective mystery story, because there is murder, there are murders. Kolchak acts as a detective on the case, even though he's a reporter, and he's following the clues, and he solves the case. The case happens to be supernatural, but this movie works as a horror movie, a comedy, and a detective story. That is an incredibly potent combination, and I think that's why it was so successful. To me personally, I had a new hero when this was all over, because Karl Kolchak was sort of like a seedy Van Helsing. He was sort of like a Van Helsing in a seersucker suit. He was a reporter, and I had a new hero, and it's no mistake that I became a journalist. That when I left high school, I set out to become a journalist, and I started my journalism studies at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., which is located just a couple of blocks away from the White House. I started in September of 1974, which was only a few weeks after Richard Nixon had resigned the presidency. So I was surrounded by students, because journalism departments that year were doing land office work. They were just doing a big business. And I was surrounded by students that wanted to be Woodward and or Bernstein. They all wanted to take down presidents, and they all wanted to meet in Deep Throat in parking garages. And I didn't want to be Woodward and or Bernstein. I wanted to be Karl Kolchak. I could aspire to that. I knew that if they made a movie of the book All the President's Men, which was out, and everybody was talking, who's Deep Throat? Who do you think Deep Throat is? Yeah, I knew if they had made a movie of All the President's Men, that they would cast somebody who looked like Robert Redford or Dustin Hoffman to play Woodward and Bernstein. And certainly nobody was confusing me with Robert Redford. But a guy who wore a sort of shabby seersucker suit and a silly little pork pie hat and had a European last name and got there through just grit and determination and keeping his head down, that I could relate to. And so I became a journalist because of Karl Kolchak. And guess what else started in September of 1974? The series version started on Friday the 13th, September 1974, Kolchak the Night Stalker on ABC. So they had already done the 2 movies, The Night Stalker and The Night Strangler, and then they did the 20 episodes. So I owed a lot to Carl Kolchak, and little did I know was that years later I would get to pay it back by writing the history of the character, then writing the first original novel featuring the character that had been done in 20 years, and also getting to know all the people who had been involved in the movie: Jeff Rice, Dan Curtis, Darren McGavin, Richard Matheson. So I have been. Life does not treat Carl Kolchak well. At the end of every case, his reward for saving the world is a swift kick in the teeth. But I have been rewarded greatly by my association with Carl Kolchak. And the very start of it was getting almost a guidance of life out of it. So I'm very fond of him. I'm very fond of the character, and I was able to sort of carry it through my entire life. But it probably wouldn't have happened. I mean, in truth, because if you think you're in charge, sometimes you just need to step back a little bit and look at your life, and look at the shape of your life, and you realize after a while that you thought you were calling the shots and making the decisions, but in truth, life pushed you in certain directions. And even though I grew up a monster kid, and even though I loved stuff, and you have to remember, my favorite television show of the growing up was The Twilight Zone. No question. It's still to my day. To this day, it's my favorite television show of all time. So, what's your favorite TV show? As much as I love Kolchak and Night Stalker, and I wrote a book on Columbo, my favorite show of all time is Twilight Zone. And when I started my journalism career, I wrote my first book. My first book was published in 1982. It was a history of the Barter Theater in Abingdon, Virginia, one of the original regional theaters, and it was part of my coverage area, and there had never been a history of it. It was amazing. Gregory Peck got his start there, Ernst Borgnine, Hume Cronin, all these wonderful actors. So I wrote the history of that book was published in 1982, and I knew what my next book was going to be. I had already started on work on it. It was going to be a history of the Twilight Zone. Why shouldn't it be me? Why shouldn't I write that book? Never stopping to think that here I was working at a 50,000 circulation paper in Kingsport, Tennessee, East Tennessee. And maybe that's not the best place to research a book on the Twilight Zone.
Probably not.
But I kind of fooled myself into thinking I was working on it, because one day in 1980, Donna Douglas came to town to shoot a commercial for mobile homes. And I ran down to the filming site, and I interviewed Donna Douglas. I talked to her about being in the Eye of the Beholder episode of The Twilight Zone and working with Rod Serling. A great interview. 2 of the actors who had gotten their start at the Barter Theater had been in Twilight Zone episodes, Fritz Weaver and Claude Akins. So I got to interview them about the Twilight Zone. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I'm on my way here. I'm going to be the guy. Then, I had an experience that a lot of writers have. Was 1982, I walked into a bookstore like a B. Dalton, remember those? And I walked in, and there it was, Mark Scott Secre's The Twilight Zone Companion, The History of the Twilight Zone. And Steve, I couldn't even get mad because Mark did such a really terrific job on that series, on that book. That book set the standard for what books on TV should be. It was terrifically researched. He did a much better job than I would have ever been able to do with it. And but being a practical fellow, I immediately set my sight on one of my other favorite shows, which was Columbo. So I said, I'll write a book as good as Mark did on the Twilight Zone on Columbo. And it took me 5 years of research and interviewing, but that book was published in 1989. It was the Columbo File. And the response to it was that it was one of the best books on a TV show ever written. I was pleased with how it came out. And I knew at that kind of point that I was going to be a mystery guy. The Columbo book probably had tagged me as mystery guy. And I knew what my next book was going to be because I had a handshake deal with the same publisher. You owe them what's called an option book when they publish your book.
Right.
So I gave the option book was going to be on Dashiell Hammett, one of my favorite writers. And I had a concept which I thought was very good. They thought was very good. And we sort of shook hands on it being the book after the Columbo file. And this is where fate stepped in. Fate stepped in and said, no, you're a monster kid. This was just a detour. You thought this was the road, but it was just a detour. We're now in charge. You're not in charge. It's like the beginning of The Outer Limits. We control your television set. And fate stepped in, and the company that owned the Mysterious Press, which published the Columbo file, Warner Books, stepped in and said, you're no longer a nonfiction press. You are no longer publishing nonfiction titles. You are just publishing mystery fiction. And the deal that was all sewn up to do the Dashiell Hammett book came loose. All the stitchings came loose. And it was at that moment that the phone on my desk at the Akron Beacon Journal, where I was the TV critic, rang. And it was a publisher, a small publisher in New York. And he said, I love your Columbo book. I said, well, thank you. He said, have you ever thought about writing a similar book on the Night Stalker? And I said, well, I love the Night Stalker. I just didn't know that there was anybody crazy enough to publish it. And he said, well, I'm crazy enough to publish it. So I said, well, wait. Let me do some research here. And let me see if I can get Dan Curtis, Richard Matheson, Jeff Rice, and Darren McGavin to say yes to the research and cooperate with it. If they say yes, I'll do the book. They did, and that book was published as Night Stalking in 1991. And then the success of that book, a small publisher in New York got the rights to do original Kolchak fiction. And they went to Jeff Rice, who had written the original 2 novels, and said, we'd like you to write the 3rd. And he said he wasn't interested in doing it at that point, but that he would let somebody else do it. And they said, well, who? And he said, I'll let Mark do it because I like what he did with Night Stalking, the nonfiction book. So they came back to me and said, you're going to write the first Kolchak novel in 20 years. And I said, I am. I don't know that I can do that. Let me give you, and I sent 5 ideas, 5 concepts to Jeff and to the publisher, all the time thinking there's one here that's really strong. And the thing is, they agreed with me. I didn't tell them which one, but they zeroed in on the same concept that I had thought of, and that's the book that became Grave Secrets, which was published in 94. And then in 1997, I revised the Night Stalking as the Night Stalker Companion. I did more interviews. And then I got to work with Richard Matheson. And that was no small honor when you see 3 books that on your name's on the cover with Richard Matheson. And you think it can't get any better than that. And then Richard includes your name in the dedication of 2 of his books, and you realize you almost can retire on that. But you see, I didn't see what was happening because you don't see what's happening when you're going through it. It wasn't until, well, what's happening? I am being pushed back to the Twilight Zone. Life is pushing me around the curve here, and I'm heading back to the Twilight Zone. I did a Dracula book next after that, and I'm starting to build the credentials on this quote-unquote spooky side of the street. I'm writing some comic book strips. I'm writing some horror short stories that are getting published, and I'm slowly working my way back. And then I shared the Twilight Zone with my daughter, Becky, when she was 15 years old. She had seen a lot of classic television at that point. She had even seen all of Night Gallery, the later series, and she loved it.
Love Night Gallery.
But when she turned 15, and I do too, but when she turned 15, I said, okay, you are done with your undergraduate work in classic television. It is time to start your postgraduate work. It is time for you to enter the Twilight Zone. So we did a forced march through all 156 episodes. We watched them in order. And we were watching an episode called Escape Clause with David Wayne. It's an early first season episode. And it's the episode where David Wayne is playing a very unpleasant hypochondriac who just wonders why he can't live forever. And at that point, a gentleman shows up smelling of brimstone and offers him a contract in exchange for his soul. that he can have immortality and indestructibility in exchange for his soul. And if you've ever watched The Twilight Zone, you know this is not going to end well for David Wayne. And sure enough, it doesn't. But when it was all over, I jokingly turned to Becky and said, you just let that be a lesson to you. Always read contracts. Read everything. Read everything in a contract.
Amen.
And we laughed because it was a joke. But then I started to think, wait. Think about 2008. Think about the banking crisis and the housing crisis. Think of all the people who signed contracts not knowing what they were signing. Think of all the trouble we got in because people didn't read contracts and didn't understand contracts. So I looked back at Becky and I said, I'm serious about this. But it became a running gag with us. We'd watch a Twilight Zone and I'd say, let that be a lesson to you. Well, I'm a slow learner. It took about 4 weeks before the penny finally dropped and I realized, this is your Twilight Zone book, stupid. This is it. All you have to do is take these life lessons. Every Twilight Zone is a parable. Every Twilight Zone is a morality tale. Every Twilight Zone contains a lesson. And all you have to do is extract the lessons. And that became the book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. I took it to my agent. She said, what a great idea. She took it to St. Martin's, and St. Martin said, what a great idea. And I got my Twilight Zone book. After all those years, I got my Twilight Zone book. And it's because life pushed me into that big circle back to where I started. And I didn't see it. And I would have said, in 30 years ago, 1989, I would have said, my path is into the mystery field. I'm going to be considered, a mystery guy. And life said, no, you're not. That's not where you really are meant to be. Look at your upbringing. Look at your childhood. Look at what gets you really, truly fired up. And it got me back to the Twilight Zone. That's a long answer, wasn't it? That was a very, very long answer.
No, I mean, it's the truthful answer, and that's the thing, Mark, is that, like you said, they always say you can never go home, but honestly, you never truly leave.
Yeah, that's a trick. Yeah,
and that's the thing, because people forget that. Okay, when you're little kids, you ask if, the boogeyman under the bed and all that's real, but by the time you're an adult, you're going, well, the things of anxiety, the things of, fear of losing your job, the things of losing control, famine, war, all those things, those are the grown-up monsters.
And there's a lot of them out there. That's exactly right. There's a lot of monsters there. And that's what Kolchak always said. Kolchak always said, and Rod Serling said metaphorically in the Twilight Zone. They said, everything was standing in. It's like that great episode of the Twilight Zone, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which, who are the monsters? We are. We are the monsters. And when you go hunting for monsters, be careful you don't turn into one yourself. It's an amazing, extracting these lessons for this book was such a wonderful experience because Rod Serling was so ahead of his time. And so much of what he wrote was of its time, but it's timeless at the same time. So many episodes are more resonant now than they were when he wrote them. They've taken on increased resonance. And it's something he shares with Mark Twain. I'll do a lecture to touch another part of my life and my writing career, because 5 of my books are Twain-centric. Both Mark Twain and Rod Serling were what Twain called moralists in disguise. Is that Twain used humor the same way that Rod Serling used fantasy. Was you cannot preach at people explicitly. They won't get the lesson. But if you use humor or you use fantasy to get the point across, they'll listen to you. And that they both banked on it, and they both won their gamble. And they both became the best-known writer on the planet in their lifetime. When people could not pick Herman Melville or Nathaniel Hawthorne out of a police lineup, they knew who Mark Twain was. When people did not know what Saul Bellow looked like or Norman Mailer, they knew what Rod Serling looked like and how he talked. And they had a general idea of who he was. So these guys were not only great writers, they were 24 karat celebrities, and very few writers actually become that. That's most writers are anonymous. They spend most of their time behind keyboards or pens, and so it's something they have in common. And something else they have in common is that if you read Mark Twain now, or you watch the Twilight Zone now, it so often does seem like Mark Twain and Rod Serling are talking about us today, and it's because they are, because human nature doesn't change, and they understood that. And they both have come from a standpoint of moral authority, where we'll take it from them. What we won't take from anybody else. What we won't listen to this political pundit or this person. When I perform as Mark Twain, I've been performing as Mark Twain for 40 years, with less makeup every year. It used to take me 2 hours to look like this. Listeners you can tell them what it looks like. But it takes shockingly little makeup for me to play Mark Twain. And when I play Mark Twain, every show I do, I've got about 6 hours of material committed to memory, so I draw from different things. But I do a section on politics, and it starts very funny. It starts with real blasts at congressmen in Washington, D.C., and then it turns serious. It turns very, very serious when he starts to talk about loyalty and what you're loyal to. And that loyalty is to your country and not to a political party or an office holder. And he starts to talk about the tyranny of the two political parties. And, afterwards people always come up and say, did you juice that? Did you make it? I said, no, it's word for word Twain. I didn't change it. But they get very quiet when I do this, when it turns serious. And they realize I'm talking about them. I'm no longer talking about politicians. I'm talking about them. You can hear a pin drop. And the silence is more powerful than the laughter in the theater at that point. And I remember because, I would not step foot on stage as Mark Twain without Hal Holbrook's permission and blessing and approval. Hal's been a very, very dear friend since the 80s. And, I remember talking to him once over dinner about this and how quiet the audience gets. And he said, I do a piece on get-rich-quick schemes and the money madness of America. And he said that they get very, very quiet on that, too. I said, why? And he said, chastened. The word you're looking for is chastened. They feel chastened because it's Mark Twain saying it to them. If we went out there and said the exact same thing, they'd kill us. They'd rip us to shreds. But when Mark Twain says it, they got to sit there and they got to take it. And that's the same thing with Rod Serling. You listen to what he was trying to tell us all those many years ago, and there's a moral authority there that still rings and resonates all these many years later. And some of the greatest, that's why, again, we're going back to where we started in a way, where we're talking about the great metaphoric uses of humor and horror, is these things talk about the human condition in ways that other ways can't. Because if you get out there and you sort of just take it head on, people put up their resistance and they won't listen to it. But if they're halfway through a horror story and all of a sudden they realize we're not really talking about ghosts or zombies or, we're really talking about this, then they're already listening. You've already got them, And it's powerful. Storytelling is the most powerful way to teach. Parables. Where have we heard that before? Teaching through parables. Well, I said that, and most people listening are probably thinking the New Testament. But it goes all the way back to the Greeks. It goes back to Aesop.
Exactly.
In which, at the end of every Aesop fable, whether it was said or not, is, and the moral of the story is, and that's what the Twilight Zone is. At the end of every Twilight Zone, it doesn't explicitly say it, but you can hear it. You can hear the words, and the moral of the story is. And that's the power of the Twilight Zone.
That's it. Mark, we're at the end of it, man. If you'll stick around long enough, I'm going to do a quick outro. Okay. Loved having you on. I'd love to have you come back, and we can touch more on just because even just the Jim Tooley thing is such an expansive thing to get into.
You keep telling that name, they don't know who you're talking about. because he's such an unknown writer. He was once a literary superstar of the 20s and 30s. And Paul Bauer and I wrote a biography of this amazing writer who came up from Irish mud poverty to make himself into a literary superstar, and he knew everybody, and he's quite a character. But you're right, that's probably about a 20-minute discussion in and of itself.
Well, I'll say this, and if you'll, like I said, stick around long enough for me to do my outro, I'll be right back with you. But the thing is, I don't think you would have guys, Jack Kerouac and things like that to really, I mean, someone probably would have, but the thing is, in the sort of way, even though each of these writers have their own style, I think he was sort of the progenitor, if I'm using that correctly, of, like you said, the wide open, unabashed truth.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very much. And he wrote about things in a unabashed, direct style. He believed that life should be recorded as it is, and he was documenting the American underclass before Steinbeck. He was writing about that experience before Woody Guthrie was in song, before Jack Kerouac. He basically anticipates all of them. And his writing is amazing because he writes like nobody else. The true test of a writer is if you can is you can read a writer and you realize it can only be that writer, is that the voice is so distinctive. The voice is so unique that it can only be that writer. And you know that. There are certain writers that don't sound like anybody else. And Tully is that. I mean, because he's got this Irish poet lyricist half of him that comes from his childhood and his upbringing and his environment and his heritage. And then he's got this jackhammer boxer approach of always peppering you with jabs. I mean, he was writing the hard-boiled style of writing before the writers who got credited with creating hard-boiled literature were there. So he was there before any of that. And he's an amazing writer. You read Tully and you're hooked. That's what got me hooked on Tully. I read Shanty Irish. That was the first book I read of Tully's, and it just took the top of my head clean off. Like, what is this? I've never read anything like this before. This guy is an Irish poet and a jackhammer all at the same time, and it's amazing stuff. Just amazing. Then he's writing about hobos, boxers, prostitutes, railroad men.
Hobos, all that stuff. And, and that's almost it's good. It's like that hit me again because you felt something. It in sort of I don't want to say necessarily a masochistic way, but there's an element of going, wow, that totally opened me wide open, and especially if there's things that maybe you have had experience with family and like I had a grandfather that traveled the rails looking for work, fell off when my mom was very young, died on the rails, and some said he fell, some said he was thrown by the railroad guys. Dark undercurrents of stuff, but it's always I see a train, that's what I think of. Some people kind of go, oh, I had a Thomas the Tank Engine. I think of, wow, my granddad got slung off one of those. That
endless ways to die on the road, endless ways that you could just the method of hopping a train. No matter how good you were, you had to run under uncertain ground, timing your speed to the same speed of the train, grabbing onto an open boxcar or a ladder or something that was there. There was an art to it, and even the best of them sometimes missed and were sucked under the train and were killed instantly by that. So just the act of hopping a train, even if there were no railroad bulls around, the bulls were the detectives who were pretty quick with the sticks. Even without them around, there were countless ways to die on the road.
Right.
So it was a very brutal life, and Tully got off the road by making himself into a writer, which is one of the most amazing things about him, is that he had had very little formal education, and he came from the Irish ditch diggers. That he comes from and he decides he wants to be a writer, which is like deciding you want to go to Mars. So it's an act of will that he makes himself into a writer. So I wish more people knew who Jim Tully was. I wish more people knew about our book, because we really hoped to put him back on the map, and it didn't. It didn't do what we had hoped it would do. But it was not for lack of trying. I have never worked harder at promoting a book than that Tully biography.
Well, and give it time. That's the thing. I think it will come, and I think maybe I can help kind of facilitate that a little bit. But Mark, I appreciate you being on. Like I said, let me go ahead and get this outro out, and I'll be right back with you, sir.
I'll be here.
Author Mark Dawidziak. The man, the myth, the legend. That was an extremely cool interview. I had a lot of fun talking with this man. It's such an interesting gentleman, but I do hope that you people will enjoy the sunlight and enjoy the fun out there. But please, as the sun sets behind the pines and the shadows grow long, make sure to check under your bed and in your closet, down the back hallway. You never know what might be waiting for you. But you know what? It's okay to be a little afraid, because there's learning in fear. So until next time, everybody, stay safe and stay scared.